Well, welcome to another chapter of Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism, our kind of 1 month teach-in and jam. We'll pretend for a month that the market isn't the solution to the problems that the market creates. We're really looking forward to today's presentation, The Weapon of Organization, 21st Century Struggles, and Mario Tronti's Marxism. But before we go there, a few stops on the way, I want to tip you off as to what's coming up for the rest of Red May. We can say it now. I think we have 5 or 6 more events, and then God knows what we will do when this is over. But we actually have another one today at 5 p.m. The Age of Circulation Struggles, with Joshua Clover, Camila Vergara, Glenn Coulthard, Michael Hart, Nick Estes, and Phil Neal, Sarah Jaffe as the moderator. And then tomorrow at 3 p.m., we have Abolish the Family with Kathy Weeks, Sarah Jaffe, Michelle O'Brien, and Sophie Lewis. At 6 p.m. tomorrow, Predation Confronts Decline. Robert Brenner and Aaron Benenev. Really looking forward to hear the economic forecast for the next few years. Going on to Saturday at 1 p.m., we have the COVID crisis and the carceral state with Dan Berger, Brett Story, J.M. Wong, Megan Ibarra and Nikita Oliver. It should be excellent. And also Jackie Wang. So check that one out at 5 p.m. The Ghosts of Marxisms, Spectre Editors in Conversation on Crisis with Charlie Post, David McNally, Holly Lewis, Kate Doyle Griffiths, Vanessa Wills, and Zachary Levinson. That's all about a new magazine called Spectre, which everybody should subscribe to. It's excellent. And I guess on Sunday, Borders and Contagion with Dan Denver, Megan Ibarra, Joss Grandillon, Malif Kanuga, and a cast of thousands. How do we put this on, you ask? Well, actually, we do it on sheer people power or whatever, but we do need some money too, not a lot. You would think we need an enormous amount given the amount of events we usually put on live. I think we had 65 scheduled live this month, and we've done close to 40 online, but we do need some money. And you go to www.redmayseattle.org and click on donate. Give us whatever you can, those small dollar donations, and go over to our YouTube description, and you'll find a link to click there at the bottom. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel, because if we get over 1,000 subscribers, and I think we're close, we get real-time CC captions, so we can, the differently abled are able to watch this discussion and conference. Anyway, enough of that. I'm going to turn you over to the moderator of today's event. Daniel Gutierrez is a member of Die Linke and a co-founder of Werkstatt für Bewegungsbildung. Through his work at the Werkstatt, he trains workers in the arts and sciences of class struggle. I like the idea that it's an art as well as a science. A doctoral candidate at the Free University of Berlin, the Freie Universität of Berlin. His research focuses generally on worker organization, power, and strategy. He's also a member of Counterpower Contrpoder. Daniel, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, so hey team. Hello everyone out there who's tuning in to check out what's going to be a great talk. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you to the comrades at Red May for putting together an incredible infrastructure. Thanks to Andrew for assembling and translating an incredible collection of works by Mario Tronti. And thanks to Maga for putting together an incredible panel of participants and thinking of me. As a militant who has had the bittersweet fortune to commit himself to class struggle in different political contexts, the labor that Andrew has dedicated to the salvage and illumination of Tronti's thought is priceless. As many in our audience know, Tronti was a central theoretician of operaismo, a current of political thought that developed in post-war Italy. Unlike many of the thinkers we've come to celebrate in the annals of critical theory, what distinguishes the intellectuals of operaismo was precisely their articulation to subjective political struggle. An intellectualism of a deeply militant character, the theory of Tronti and his cohort were not concerned in what was or what is, but how to destroy the present. In this regard, science itself was a domain of struggle. In one of my favorite passages by Tronti, he remarks, "Big industry and science are not the prize for whoever wins the class struggle. They are the battlefield itself. So long as the enemy occupies that field, we have to spray it with bullets without crying over the roses that get destroyed along the way." Indeed, for Tronti, knowledge is deeply connected to struggle. Whoever has true hatred, Tronti declared, has truly understood. The translations of these works fills an important gap in the development of Tronti's thought. As someone committed to proletarian victory against the bourgeois death cult, I deeply appreciate and anticipate the insights into struggle that this conversation here will help generate. Without further ado, let me give the floor to Andrew before moving on to Renee, and then Manuel, and finally Maga. Andrew Anastasi is the editor and translator of Weapon of Organization, Mario Tronti's Political Revolution in Marxism, forthcoming in September 2020 from Common Notions. He is a member of the Viewpoint magazine editorial collective and a PhD candidate in sociology at CUNY. Andrew, all yours.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for that beautiful introduction and for moderating our panel today. Thanks to Sean and to Philip of Red May for entrusting us with this. Thanks especially to Maga, Manuel, and Renee for joining me. And lastly, thanks to Andy Battle, my editor on this book. Even editors need editors, as we all know. And Malav Kanuga, the publisher of Common Notions, for helping to make that book happen and this panel as well. So thanks again. I'll start by just talking a little bit about the impetus for this panel. As Daniel already began to sketch for you all, today we'll be talking about Mario Tronti's Marxism and 21st century struggles. Now, Tronti is a Marxist philosopher from Italy who in the 1960s was the principal theorist of a current of thought known as operaismo, or workerism. His most famous book, Workers and Capital, was published in 1966, and just now, finally, after more than 50 years, in 2019, Verso Books published a full English translation of it. I've prepared a second book of translations of Tronti's work of the 1960s, which we've used to give this panel its name, The Weapon of Organization. In the spirit of Red May, we wanted to put together a sort of unorthodox panel. This is not a book release because the book won't be out till September, nor is it a strictly academic panel, although we've all gone through universities and most of us still work in them. This panel is really trying to think about revolutionary theory. And so we have a panel of theoretically sophisticated activists and organizers on the left. I think this is important for a few reasons. Throughout the 1960s, Tronti's work displayed a single-minded purpose, which Daniel has also mentioned. He wanted to contribute to the working class struggle in Italy to overthrow the regime of capital and its state. Deeply inspired by Lenin, he believed that revolutionary organization was essential to this process, and moreover, that revolutionary theory was an important weapon in that struggle. So although Tronti's work can be quite technical when concerned with Marxian categories, he also has an elegant and direct style that's really evocative and poetic. For anyone who's read it, you know what I mean. And it really aims to excite the reader to action. And it has done that. It has excited many people to action over the past 50 years. In a sense, it's theory for militants. Just a brief word about my book, and then I'll move on from it. But the texts I pulled together range from 1959 to 1967, effectively bookending the years during which the main essays of Workers and Capital were published. These are political texts first and foremost, and ones that speak to the joys and difficulties of collective practice. You can pre-order it from the Common Notions website and support an independent left publisher during a crucially difficult time if you are so inclined. I hope you will. But enough on the book itself. I want to say a few more words about the context in which Tronti was writing, and then I want to quickly survey a few themes that I think the other panelists may want to touch on, or obviously they'll also bring some other ones into the discussion as well. Okay, so like all conjunctural political writings, Tronti's work was rooted in a particular context. After World War II, Italy went through an intense period of capitalist development, focused on the industrial triangle in the north of Milan, Genoa, and Turin. Many of the workers who staffed the assembly line at Fiat, for example, the massive automobile manufacturer, which is still around, many of these workers came from the poor and underdeveloped regions of Italy's south. These migrants played a major role in the struggles that traversed the peninsula in the 1960s. Now, for much of the 1950s, there had been less overt class struggle, fewer strikes, and there was this sort of widespread assumption among folks on the left, among sociologists, among Marxists, that workers had possibly been integrated into the Italian miracle of post-war development. But in the late 1950s, there was a massive renewal of strike activity. From 1958 to 1959, there was a tripling in the hours of work lost to strikes. Few on the left saw this coming. And then from 1960 to 1962, strikes quadrupled. So in 1962, after these strike hours have quadrupled, you also have a riot. You have a riot in Turin at the Piazza Statuto, where workers and unemployed proletarians from the city pelted the headquarters of a reformist union that had just signed an agreement with Fiat in the middle of a metal workers' strike. So you have this sort of upswelling of activity at the end of the 50s and the early 1960s. What was going on? You know, this was the context in which Quaderni Rossi, or the Red Notebooks, was born. This was a journal put together by Raniero Panzieri, which published workers' inquiries and efforts of co-research launched by the likes of Romano Alquati, Vittorio Rieser, and others. They wanted to try to understand what was going on inside the factories of Fiat and elsewhere, how workers were relating to their work, how they were engaged in sabotage and refusal of work, and how they planned their more overt collective struggles. And right then, another point that I want to emphasize is that in 1962, 1963, right as we have this huge uptick in strikes and the riot of Piazza Statuto, you see this sort of extraordinary move of reformism at the national political level. The president of Fiat endorses a center-left government, one which would include the Italian Socialist Party for the first time. Now, Tronti, looking at all this, he sees this as a political response to the uptick in workers' struggles, as a way to channel and contain them by institutionalizing some worker representation in government, launching centralized economic planning, which meant regular wage increases given out rather than won through unpredictable strikes, which screwed with the flow of profit for firms like Fiat. And so faced with all of this, a wing of the reigning centrist Christian Democrat Party, along with some major capitalists, saw the center left as a wise choice for the long-term interests of capital in general. What did Tronti think about all this? He proposed that workers' struggles propelled capitalist development. For Tronti, capital's survival depended on its ability to recuperate working class demands via the capitalist state for its own benefit. Capital used workers' fights for higher wages and their refusal of work to spur its own innovation, investing in machinery, intensifying exploitation, extending its domination over the whole society. The working class needed to grow, for Tronti, in political terms, starting from the antagonism embodied, sorry, I lost my space, starting from the antagonism that was embodied in the rebellious subjectivity of industrial workers, right? So there needed to be some sort of break for Tronti, beyond these struggles around the factory, beyond these struggles around the problem of the wage and working conditions. There needed to be something that rose to a different sort of level, because capital itself was driven by these struggles. Okay, so meanwhile, we also have to understand quickly the context of the Italian Communist Party. Some of these workers engaging in these struggles had connections to the Italian Communist Party, but many did not. In the 1950s, the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, was essentially committed to the notion of a collapse, that eventually the contradictions of capitalism would mean the whole thing would fall apart, and there they would be. Reformism and gradualism dominated the official policy of the party under Palmiro Togliatti. And at the same time, the PCI was in a membership crisis. In 1955, the metal workers trade union called FIOM, with close ties to the PCI, lost half of its representatives in the internal commissions of Fiat and Turin. Over the next decade, from 1956 to 1966, the PCI loses 25% of its members. And in 1966, only 3% of workers under the age of 30 years old in Turin are in the PCI, right? So the PCI is also in crisis at this time. But Tronti decided by the mid-1960s that the PCI would actually, or could actually, be a vehicle for this new worker antagonism. It would need to change. It would need to create new channels of communication to the factory. It would need to overhaul its organizational structure. It would need to experiment with new political slogans. And this was highly contentious among his comrades, as many of you well know, with Antonio Negri being the key exponent on the other side of this debate within Operaismo. And this was a split that occurred basically around 1966, 1967, when they closed down their shared endeavor, the newspaper Classe Operaia. Okay, so why the PCI for Tronti? I think that this will help us understand some of the revolutionary import for thinking about this today. Bear with me on this context. Tronti believed that the workers had not yet, and would not perhaps, forge organizations on their own on a scale adequate to the task of revolution. So I think we're going to be able to discuss this a little bit later and what precisely it means for an organization to be a self-organization, what it would mean to introduce organization from without, things like this. The point for Tronti was that without posing the question of state power, struggles over wages and working conditions would redound to the benefit of capital. The PCI would need to be completely renovated, and the way to do this was through experiments. And in the 1960s, when Workers and Capital was being written, or the essays that would later be collected as Workers and Capital were being written, Tronti was precisely engaged in these kinds of experiments, collective organizational experiments, to try to find some way for Marxist intellectuals to contribute to a surprising upsurge in working class self-activity, struggles by workers that were not foreseen by the left parties or unions, and which existed in a sort of contentious and contradictory relationship with the existing institutions on the left. Tronti thought that perhaps writing, editing, and distributing a newspaper for workers, infused with revolutionary theory, could provide the material basis for some new organizational form, a new nucleus, or even a cadre structure for militants. After 1964 and the death of the longtime head of the PCI, Togliatti, Tronti thought actually that they could take over and replace the leadership of the party. This brings us to this question of militancy, which I'm sure we also will be able to discuss, and which Daniel alluded to. In Italian, they have this phrase, ceto politico, which we don't really have the best translation for in English. I like to say political stratum. Other people say political elite. Some say political class. But the idea is that there's a sort of layer of professional revolutionaries, a layer of militants. The capitalists have theirs, and the working class also has their own. For Tronti, there's not exactly this obsession with organic intellectuals emerging only from authentically proletarian upbringing, because those partisans of the working class point of view are those who commit themselves to the struggle against capital, right? This is how he saw he and his comrades operating. Likewise, workers, and this is also important for him, workers are not by dint of their objective social location necessarily revolutionary subjects. So in this sense, Tronti's theory of class was anti-sociological. It was a thoroughly political notion of class. Okay, and for Tronti, like Lenin, a revolutionary subject only comes into being through the political work of articulation between these two layers, if you like. And this isn't because workers are stupid or that they need intellectuals to tell them what to think. It's because individual struggles that are not coordinated end up actually strengthening capitalist development. Okay, so this is sort of one example of how Tronti understood the relationship between militancy, struggles, capital, and the state. We now have many great panelists who speak from different contexts and experiences, and I'd love to hear from them about how they approach these kinds of problems or others, how they conceptualize the relationship between movements and the state's reform efforts, how militants relate to self-activity that is not necessarily planned from above, but percolates up from below, perhaps in a more spontaneous fashion, maybe from tenants, from commuters, or from domestic workers. And of course, there are always networks of invisible organization going on. Self-organization of struggles might be a better way to think about this concept of spontaneity. I guess the question, though, that Tronti puts on the table for us is about this link or the leap from local resistance to global revolution. And I'm curious to hear, if any of this resonates with our other panelists or folks in the audience, if they want to ask questions later about the problem of organization. Thanks a lot.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate that very insightful presentation. Now I'm going to pass it over to Renee. Renee Christian Moya is Director of Housing as a Human Right and has been active in the LA Tenants Union and the Concrete Media Collective. I pass it over to you, Renee. Thank you.
Hi, folks, and thank you again for the invite. I'm actually really happy to be on it during May because, I got the thought last night that while, this might be Red May, it's looking like this summer is going to be a hot summer, given the amount of activity that we're seeing, given the fact that the moment that we're in is as politically charged as it is. And that's not even saying anything of the high political kind of drama, right? Given the fact that we're in the middle of an election season. I guess I wanted to add a little bit more about the kind of the background that I kind of operate in. I'm not only a member of the LA Tenants Union, and I'll be talking mostly from that perspective shortly, but I did also want to say that I'm a member of the School of Echoes, which is an international collective of artists and organizers who have been mostly reflecting on questions of gentrification and the struggles of working class people in our urban areas for the last really 8 years. I've only been a member of that for about half that time, but still it's been a place where I've been able to sharpen, I think, a lot of my politics. A lot of them that started with a lot of the stuff that Andrew was just talking about, so I'll be really happy to talk about that. But I mentioned the School of Echoes, though, because I think it's important to outline a little bit of how it is that the LA Tenants Union came to be. How is it that an autonomous movement of tenants in the city of LA started as a one meeting a month organization 4 or 5 years ago, and now has 13 chapters across the city meeting twice a week, plus a general meeting that meets once a month, plus a number of committees, both at the local and union level, that meet at least once a month as well at this point. And so really it starts at the School of Echoes. It starts in this collective of again, artists and community organizers who really put at the center of their militant action or work, initially the process of listening. And what we mean by that, it was basically talking to working class people in our communities about what were the issues that they were confronting, that they were facing. And what that ended up doing was it started off a process that lasted about 2 years, a learning process, talking to members of the community in areas of Central LA, South LA, and also East LA, discussing what were the things, the problematics that they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And quickly we landed on, or the collective landed on, a realization, if you will, that, well, there were two things that really happened at the same time. One, there was an analysis that emerged from that out of what is capital in the 21st century, what does it look like? And how do cities in particular play an important role in the reproduction of capital and the circuits of capital in the 21st century, after the reversal of things like white flight and the increasing power of real estate capital, in particular, that fraction of capital in the last 20 to 30 years, really with the emergence of neoliberalism. And so the collective really developed an analysis around the centrality of real estate capital in particular to the development of capital in the developed world over the last 20 to 30 years. And we'll talk a little bit about that, I hope, when we come to talk about our work and our analysis around things like questions of gentrification and the like. But the other aspect of that was an analysis of really the subjectivity of the working class folks that we were talking to. It became increasingly important or obvious to the folks that we spoke to that they saw themselves basically as protagonists in a struggle. Oftentimes, we have to say very clearly, an atomized subjects of struggle against this process of gentrification. They increasingly saw themselves as tenants and not necessarily as workers after they left their working sites, right? And so it became an imperative for us to engage in the question of, well, how do you organize the working class outside of the points of production, right? What do we do? How do we meet both real estate capital and the workers who are confronting it on a day-to-day basis? How do we meet them outside of that space? And so out of this 2-year-long process came the creation of the LA Tenants Union. The LA Tenants Union started again, initially, before there was a tenants union, as a proto-union, if you will, that started around the struggle in defense of certain tenants who were being evicted from their homes. Eventually, those folks those tenants associations of buildings ended up essentially coming together and agreeing to form a thing called the LA Tenants Union that met once a month initially. And then eventually in the last couple of years, we've split up into taking a kind of a local community organizing perspective for reasons that I think a number of us will be talking about today. Why do we talk about organizing at the local level? So why the LA Tenants Union? I want to start by saying on this question that the Los Angeles Tenants Union is not a housing justice organization. As one of my close comrades loves to say, and I know Maga, you know her well, she loves to tell people that housing doesn't need lawyers, housing doesn't get evicted, housing doesn't suffer the repercussions of evictions, housing doesn't end up getting evicted and then end up on the streets, end up homeless as a result of an eviction. Housing isn't harassed by landlords, right? Ultimately, the persons who are affected in this way are tenants themselves. And so we always tell ourselves, and we exclusively define ourselves as a tenants' rights movement, because ultimately the subject of our political struggle are tenants themselves. And in a place like LA, where 2/3 of the residents of the city are tenants, the vast majority of whom are people of color, working class people of color, those folks in particular, especially when you look at African American and Latino residents of the city of LA and renters in particular, they spend upwards of 60% of their rent, or their money, I should say, on rent. And I should say, as a little quick digression, it's why whenever I have these discussions with my union friends, I always say to them, what good does it matter that you get a 3 to 5% wage increase at work if your rent's going to increase by 5 to 10 to 15% a year, right? And I think this is an appreciation that slowly but surely some of the more progressive, quote unquote, unions are kind of cottoning onto that reality. And finally, this is again a city where over half of the residents of the city cannot afford to continue to pay the places that they live in, right? A couple of principles that were central to our organizing. We describe ourselves as an autonomous movement of tenants. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean a couple of things, actually. The one basic one, the one initial one that I think a lot of people kind of immediately understand is the fact that we are not a nonprofit. There are no staff members in the LA Tenants Union, none of them whatsoever. Obviously, for a variety of reasons, given the class backgrounds of a number of our members, some folks have more time than others to be able to contribute to the work of the union and to continue to reproduce it. But generally, this union, we don't have paid staffers. We don't have anyone who supports us in that way. We're not a traditional nonprofit in any way, shape, or form. That, of course, comes with consequences, right, to how we are able to reproduce the union, but it also creates, I think, a particular sort of culture of militant autonomy. I think that anyone who has ever been to a LATU meeting can tell you that it is very much front and center of our politics to constantly remind people that unless we do things will not happen on their own, right? We are the ones who are going to save ourselves. It is not an external sort of force, whether it be the pre-existing infrastructure of progressivism in the United States, or again, existing nonprofits that go into housing or do things around housing. On that question as well, we're not a nonprofit. We are also completely autonomous from the existing infrastructure of the progressive left, both for or from the party, if you will, the Democratic Party. We don't have a PT in the United States, but there is the unavoidable question of what the Democratic Party is and how it relates to social movements, and we can talk about that a little bit today. But there is also the question of the existing trade unions, right? And given the fact that the tenants union, even though again it models itself as a union, has very consciously taken on critiques of the existing labor architecture in constructing this, this organization that we work in. The second meaning, though, for us about, on what we mean by saying that we are an autonomous movement of tenants, though, has to do with tactics and organization, right? And what we mean by that is that, the broad tenants' rights movement in the last 10 to 15 years in a place like California has been very oriented around coalition work in particular, right? Or as I like to call it, the piling up of little pebbles of different organizations across the state, and that builds the movement, that creates the movement. It is one of the kind of abiding criticisms, I think, that the LA Tenants Union has waged on the existing infrastructure of quote unquote housing justice in this country, and in particular in California, that we reject that notion. We don't think that that is movement building. That is necessary coalition building work, but that does not a movement make. And for that reason, we find it important to be able to say that what drives our work really is the experience of our tenants. And that is how we engage if and when we do engage with the political system. That is the overriding question or objective that drives that. On that question of existing organizations, though, we had to contend very clearly with an existing infrastructure, again, of progressivism in a place like California, where, there is a long and storied and, I would say proud history of organizing of the working class, although not always along explicitly or consciously class-focused efforts. And what that meant specifically was organizing into the breach against oftentimes existing housing organizations that frankly, these nonprofit organizations who had basically professionalized what they meant by, organizing on the one hand, and on the other hand, had kind of solutions to the increasing injustice of the housing market for a lot of our communities. This idea, in other words, that we're going to solve the housing crisis, for example, by just simply, quote unquote, building our way out of the crisis, completely ignoring the way that the housing market itself is segmented depending on one's ability to pay, and especially around certain neighborhoods. It's the lingering sort of experience of redlining, but in a very different way in the latter half of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century. Being able to struggle against that push to bureaucratize the solutions to the housing crisis has been very paramount and difficult for us at times, not because it drives any kind of internal strife within the union, but because it doesn't always make us popular. Very often we hear criticisms from existing elected officials and even some housing justice organizations for the way that we do things. Although my retort is always that there's a reason why we are the most vibrant existing, housing justice or tenant justice organization in the city, and why our membership has tripled over the last 2 months as a result of the COVID crisis. Those are just some of the outlines that I wanted to give on there. But I did want to say a couple of things, I think, before I move it along. I think a lot of this conversation will probably be driven through questions. I wanted to give an outline, though, of what this work looks like. I wanted to talk about a couple of things. I wanted to talk about the fact that we need to talk about that we have to talk a little bit about, I was told I have to, control my hand gestures. It's the Latino in me. Very sorry, folks. First off, about conceptualizing or reconceptualizing what we mean by gentrification and treating it as an issue of class struggle. I think this is something that I would like, us to discuss a bit, because I think that we are in a very different moment, obviously, to Tronti's situation, not just because of where capital is, again, on the one hand, but also, again, because the hole at the center of our kind of organized working class politic very much matters to the political dynamics that we're in, and also how we read Tronti, I would say. Again, we don't have a peachy to be our foil, right? I'd also like to talk a little bit about how, or explore a little bit more the question that I think Andrew already kind of kicked the door open to, which is, what is the role of the capitalist state in co-opting the movement, right? And co-opting our demands, and how clear-eyed are we in recognizing that? I will close that aspect by just saying a few things, which is that the LA Tenants Union, one of the criticisms we've received a few times actually has been the fact that we, quote unquote, don't do politics, that we don't we're not a traditional housing organization that goes to do lobbying in Sacramento or spends our time taking tenants to city council. And that has consequences. On the other hand, there have been reforms that we have very much been the drivers of, but we have done it, I guess our way of driving those reforms has been maybe a little bit different to how other organizations have done it. We have pushed forward demands autonomously because we believe that tenants have the power ourselves. We are demanding nothing, we're taking everything, right? To borrow a little quip here. This idea that the tenants themselves already have this power and we have to manifest that power. And if the politicians follow us, then good. And an example of that is that here in Los Angeles, we have been the driving force behind an anti-tenant harassment ordinance that is kind of slowly, finally snaking its way through the LA City Council. It would prevent a lot of the worst abuses, a lot of the excessive abuses that we see against tenants. It's really just more than anything a tool for us to use in fighting back against landlords moving forward. But I think that is an illustrative example of how it is that we have to be very clear-eyed, focused in how movements interact or engage with the state. We do not accept that this is something, if we do get this thing passed soon, and hopefully we do, this is not something that we accept it has been given to us because of the good graces of a generous politician. In fact, the politician who put this forward to begin with is someone who is now facing an indictment for corruption charges by the FBI. So it is not out of the good graces and good politics of an elected official that we are getting these things. We got these things because we demanded them and we worked towards them. And I think that there's more that we need to say about how our movements traditionally have related to the state, because I don't think that for the most part we've done that. I know there's a lot of stuff that we want to talk about, and I think it would be better if we kind of deal with them maybe in questions, but I have a lot of thoughts, if you will, on things like militancy, on the nature, I think, of the party or the lack thereof when we are in the space like the United States, and the role of actually organic intellectuals, because again, given the fact that the LA Tenants Union was born out of a collective of militants, there's a question, I think, about how that relates, how that existing collective and other spaces that have slowly kind of intruded into the LA Tenants Union space, what is their role within that movement and how do we work together? But I'll stop there for now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rene. That was really great. I'm now going to pass it over to Manuel Criollo, a longtime distance organizer and political educator born in Los Angeles, California, Tongva territory with family roots in El Salvador. A PhD student in American Studies at the University of New Mexico, Manuel has dedicated no small part of his life to anti-capitalist struggle, working with the Labor Community Strategy Center in Los Angeles for over 18 years and a current member of Red Nation. Manuel, I pass it over to you.
Hey everyone, really thank you for having me in this great panel. And these are very heavy days with this ongoing pandemic that has taken over nearly 100,000 people in this country called the United States, and not to even consider the impacts of many in the world. And the recent killing of George Floyd is really heavy on my heart right now. And tens of millions of unemployed, uninsured, and just the vicarious living conditions of millions in this country, which I think Rene spoke very eloquently. We have to really think about take full stock of the utter failure and destructive logic of capitalism and imperialism. And so, with that note, I really want to thank Andrew and Maga for the invitation, and really honored to be part of this panel, and really look forward to building with everybody on this panel. I really want to thank again Andrew for the labor of love and really the labor of struggle, I assume, of taking on this project to translate and give Mario Tronti's work another chance to breathe, to be given another pair of eyes, and for a new generation to consider his work. In reading through the draft manuscript, what comes to life is, a very depth and wealth of knowledge production, of militancy, of commitment that Tronti and his comrades really showed. And I'm hoping that I could do in my short talk here is to discuss three things that I think are seem in line with Tronti's writings and what Andrew labored to translate, interpret, and retrieve these writings. One is, how do we actually think about the actual process of organizing and organizational building as an actual task, as a theory, and as a praxis? In this case, to consider, as the book title is called, Organization as a Weapon, especially for our times, and how this process of rescuing the breadth of experimentations, of innovations, and organizational forms that took place in the 1960s and 70s, and why is it so necessary for us to take this task really seriously and not just assume that there's a certain kind of metaphysical spontaneity that happens in the organizing process. And I think that in some ways that is one of our failures, is to really take this as an actual science and art. I think it was Daniel who I heard the concept of art and science. The second is to really consider Tronti's concept of anti-capitalist rebellious subjectivities and sort of new forms of working class struggles and cultures of resistance outside of the point of production. So I'll be building for what Renee spoke into, and in particular, how do we build outside of labor unions and political parties and put them in conversation with a lot of the work that I did with the Los Angeles-based bus riders union throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s. And third, in line of thinking of moving working class struggles, I really want to see if we have some time at the end to also think about what has also changed since the 1970s. And I particularly think for any movement that is serious about organizing oppressed nationality peoples in the United States, or really across the world, but even working class struggles here in the United States, is how do we think about also taking on the task of the police and the task of actually seeing that as a real working class struggle that is going to be imperative for the future of our movement. So the first thing is, again, this is a real, this book is really a gift. I think of it really is trying to reconstruct our sense of history, reconstruct the idea of the hard task of actually building organizations. When you read Tronti's work, you see the nuances, the kind of conjunctural readings of the moment, the experimentation of movement building, sometimes being inside a form, sometimes being outside a form, how to really have a real, deep sense of having an ear on the ground to know how workers are refusing, how workers are struggling, and actually thinking about how do we actually build, three sort of important components of building an organization: consciousness, leadership, and organization. And I think that is really important for us to take up this as an actual task and an actual praxis of organizing an organization. I felt in that sense, much of what one of our weaknesses in this country in particularly is that we often look at history and movement history specifically through two kind of lenses. One is to sort of give the glory of the revolution, the glory of the individual organizer, and on one hand, on the other hand, it's kind of the disillusionment of our experiments, everything that the movement got wrong, and I think that's a very stagnant way of understanding history. And I think what Andrew's doing with his book is actually giving us the task of how do we read conditions, how do we prefigure our vision, how do we ultimately go and do the work, right? And so, building an organization is a very hard praxis, and it's not just about how do we read the moment, how do we understand our theory into our practice, or just doing practice alone, right? Is an insufficient form of building an organization. And so I just think for anybody who's really is serious, I hope that they really take up this set of readings as sort of an important sort of task for us to be able to understand that. I want to move secondly into this idea of the anti-capitalist subjugation and that Tronti, or these new forms of class struggles. I want to speak about my experience with the bus riders union, very much in line to what Renee is speaking to. How do we, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and my mom was a seamstress, my grandmother cleaned houses, pretty much all my family, who I often think are mainly all women, are the ones that really have taken the task of really making and running this city and in Los Angeles. And one of the main ways to get around was the bus. And I joined the Bus Riders Union in 1998. It was kind of an experimental organization that grew out of an important sort of linkage to Tronti's history is that the organization was birthed, I would say, at three different places. One is the actual anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist new communist movement. Many members of the League of Revolutionary Struggle were founders of the Strategy Center and the Bus Riders Union, people like Eric Mann, Leanne Hurst Mann. But the second round of people who joined the bus riders were actual bus riders themselves. And when we think about what the organization did really specifically that I think was important is that it actually built an organization that actually recruited high militants of the civil rights movement, people like Woodrow Coleman, who really was one of the desegregators of the city of Los Angeles. You had militants of the FMLN, militants of, at that time, the PDR, organizations, immigrants from who had formed the Justice for Genders campaigns, people who had built the campaigns to rebuild like Local 11, were critical people who actually helped found the organization. And I think of it as a working class on wheels. You know, how do we build, you know, this is now the 80s and 90s. Where did you find sort of, you know, large amount of working class people that is no longer in sort of a factory, right? The bus is the important aspect of that factory on wheels, where you have lines that carry 90,000, 60,000, 45,000, even up to this day, they still carry that amount of riders each day going from different dispersed sort of work. And this was the beginning of dispersal of work, right? We start seeing, you know, janitorial workers, not, you know, in small numbers per building, you know, domestic workers. You looked at the sort of still kind of up but yet dying forms of also like the garment industry in Los Angeles, all the kind of hustle jobs like security guards, right? And of course you had the unemployed, you had also, you know, a lot of elderly folks that this was the primary way that they did it. And this was a working class organization that was taking on both kind of the cutbacks of service and fare increases and, you know, the all the ways that life was impossible for a lot of working class folks to get around. But more importantly, it was sort of challenging the LA region sort of neoliberal and gentrification, sort of social, economic, and political order that gave life to, really was struggling against everything that we see in Los Angeles today, which is, you know, the pushing out of working class communities, the, you know, the push for a new form of so-called redevelopment, which was mainly the removal of working class folks from the primary sort of zones of the city. You looked at, you know, thinking of actual, how do you build an organization of working class people outside of that sort of realm of the work? And so I think, you know, as Renee says, you know, we also we're trying to build sort of an independent form of the Democratic Party, an independent form of, from the AFL-CIO. When you think about the redevelopment of the city itself, right? The AFL-CIO was completely in line to the redevelopment of the city, right? And that meant that they also, in fact, pitted a lot of working class people like construction workers, like, you know, service workers, pitted against, you know, other working class folks who were in sort of these low wage, you know, deindustrialized sort of job forms that existed. So I think that it's really important for us to think about in Andrew's own work, he speaks about the campaign to stop Amazon in Queens. And I think that's important for us to think about. How do we think about struggles outside of the realm of the point of production? And I think, especially in this new time period when work itself is a sort of vicarious sort of industry, how do we think about the different ways that we actually can organize people in different public spaces is going to be an important sort of aspect for us to think about, you know. And of course, you know, when we thought about this campaign called the Bus Riders Union, right, it was also a way to also protect much of what was already the eroding sort of rights for workers. The erosion of either, if you win a major contract, but then you lose it by having to pay extra additional fares, then you lose that wage that you might increase through the unionization of your sector. Or if the increased sort of wages, if an increased wage goes along with increases in your rent, increases in your transportation, then you lose a complete sense of social wage. So, and I think the last thing that I want to say about this is that we were able to organize thousands of people into this forum. You know, there's still a lot of work to be doing to both kind of understand what its significance was, what it meant. But I think the proudest thing that we are very proud of building was that we actually still have leaders, and to this day in Los Angeles, that came out of the Bus Riders Union, that came out of the Strategy Center, that are building still new movements that are reemerging. And I think of all those things, those are the most things that we're really excited. The last thing I really want to talk about this is, you know, in terms of, you know, what's different now from the 60s and 70s. And I think, you know, yesterday I was really bummed out about this, and it just really, you know, very heavy heart with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And I sort of stumbled on this movie called Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. Now, I knew of this movie because it, you know, it talks a lot about the alienation of the worker, talks a lot about, you know, the kind of how the worker becomes a machine to capitalism, the multiple ways that, you know, the system's trying to speed up, you know, work for people. But the other thing that I really found fascinating watching that film was how much the police was so present in that film. And I feel that in many ways, you know, how do we not lose also the sight of the police, not just as an arm of the state, but sort of an ideological arm that's very important for us to challenge. And for me, you know, I think that is very important for us in building sort of new momentum around working class struggles. We have to really take seriously how we challenge this infrastructure called the police. You know, there's organizations like in Oakland, the Black Organizing Project, trying to remove police in schools. You have, even to this day, forums like Bus Riders Union and Fight for the Soul of the City in Los Angeles are trying to talk about how do we think about free fares and in the criminalization and removal of police in public transportation. Or, you know, in my own organization now, the Red Nation has the Red Deal, which talks about divesting from ending the occupation and to reinvest it in healing our bodies, creating new jobs, and heal our planet, as sort of a way to think about how do we challenge, not only how do we envision a new world, but that we have to take on the actual bodies of violence that are not just the violence that they create, but is also the violence that the maintaining of its sense of order, how normalized it is that a city like Los Angeles or a city like here in Albuquerque that I'm at, where you're taking 40, 50, 60% of a total city budget and investing in police. I think it's going to be an important aspect for us to try to really rethink again, how do we think about these struggles, not just as a racial justice issue, which often here in the United States is perceived, but more importantly, how do we perceive this as sort of a class nature struggle? And I'm hoping that in thinking about what has sort of shifted from the 60s and 70s, where a lot of this infrastructure around policing and violence was implemented to actually stop a lot of these experiments of the left, of the Black liberation movement, of the Native liberation movement, of the women's liberation movement, that you put this infrastructure of police, and now how it's become such a commonplace and sort of common sense of society, and why is it going to be important for us to challenge it? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Manuel. Those are really pertinent insights and critical questions you brought up around questions of organization and contemporary terrains of class struggle. I now hand over to our last participant, Magali Miranda Alcázar is a graduate student in Chicano Studies at UCLA. She is a Eugene Covarrubias Fellow and Ford Foundation Pre-Doctoral Fellow, if I got that right. Her academic work focuses on virtual ethnography and domestic work platforms. Over to you, Maga.
Hi. I don't know how to follow up on Renee and Manuel, but I'm really honored to be on a panel with other militants. I also want to encourage Andrew and Danielle. I know you're not technically panelists, but I think that you both also have a lot of organizing experience and kind of experience as militants, both kind of on the theory and the practice side. So I think I'm not sure how to enter this conversation in a lot of ways, because I was like, one of my frustrations was like, I was like, Andrew, why did you translate this? I haven't even gotten through the workers and capital yet. So it's kind of exciting, but it's also, I think, a little bit overwhelming for me to kind of receive a lot of this kind of these reinterpretations, these and then in addition to that, right, like situate them in their historical context, and then on top of that, be asked to think about what that means for us today. But it's like an exciting project. It's like when you get a really cool Christmas present and you don't know where to start. So I'm coming into this conversation in that spirit, right? Like of just kind of experimentation or curiosity. So I think I'm really looking forward to more of the discussion, because I think that then we'll get into some of the kind of nitty gritty. I guess I wanted to start with an observation about Tronti's workers and capital, and just Tronti's whole body of work. And so you're writing on it, Andrew, which is that, I had this sort of preconceived notion. I know a lot of people who are like deep into kind of labor theory of value sort of conversations about the operaísta tradition and the role that the autonomy of the political, these kind of self-organizations, the working class, these sort of categories have in kind of operaísta thinking. And one of these theories is that that there's this primacy of the working class in capital, and that there's a kind of wholesale rejection of the laws of motion of capital. So you can imagine sort of my surprise as I'm reading more of this kind of material, to discover that Tronti is actually extremely technical, and a very technical reader of capital, especially, really, really takes apart some of these chapters on the working day, and really kind of reimagines them, kind of retools them in sort of interesting ways. Like if you are, as I have had conversations with folks who are kind of into labor theory of value, or even the kind of I've read at this point I've read Capital with like the labor theory of value people, and I've also read it with the International Marxist Humanist Organization, the Humanist. And so then, each time you read Capital, you're like, this is not the same book that I've read before. So this is really, I was really excited from that perspective, right? Like just as a kind of nerd of Capital to discover some of Tronti's more technical readings of the working day, especially. And in that sense, I was really interested in understanding this kind of interpretation. Tronti doesn't just sort of ignore the laws of motions of capital, doesn't just like read them and say whatever, but that he interprets them specifically as in relation to what he calls the political laws of movement of the working class, forced by the subjective power of organization crudely to serve the objective revolutionary needs of class antagonism and the struggle. So in this retooling, it's not just a kind of accidental or nonchalant treatment, but that he's really thinking about kind of the political laws of movement and the working class and how those things shape. And I think that that's something that, in hearing Renee and Manuel, I really wanted to go after, because I was like, how does this relate? But hearing Manuel and Renee's kind of thinking about, I think what's interesting in their work is that it's sort of social movement work, and it sort of has this autonomous character but it's always in relation to thinking about these kind of these laws of movement of capital, right? And like where the subjective kind of antagonism is in that moment, it reflects on what's happening with the laws of capital. So I think that that's from a really kind of technical theoretical perspective, one of the things that was important. I think that for me, this question of composition becomes really important because for Tronti, right, composition can be understood in terms of the technical composition, in terms of like machines, labor power, these kinds of things, but also really, but the technical composition is also political, right? He says that, I think you said this, Andrew, in some of your introductions, various writings, that the economic downturn might provide an opportunity for militants or politicians to recompose their own side. It might erode the existing base of unity of the kind of social capital, and it might hasten the decomposition of certain energies. And so that's why strategy and tactic becomes really important. And so I think one of the gifts of Tronti's work is really helping us think through these questions of political composition. So what is the kind of, you might have workers in a factory, but as we know, especially as people of color, right? This is why I think this is also really interesting, that you might work in the same factory and have a completely antagonistic relationship to a white worker in the same factory, right? So that there's not necessarily a relationship between the technical composition and the political composition of the class, because that's there's a problem of kind of organization and subjectivity, and that he says that this is what's particular and peculiar about the commodity of labor powers, that it has this whole social life. So with that said, I'm really interested in my work. So I was trying to think about how this sort of relates to, you've been in the left and the left so long that you're like, I don't even know where to start, right? Like, you're talking about like, oh, domestic work. I'm like, yeah, I guess that's sort of like my research, but that's not really like where I came about. Like, am I a militant? I don't know. So one of the things that I thought about in terms of strategy is this question of kind of strategy and knowledge production. And I think that's really, really interesting, in both in Tronti's kind of personal history and in some of his writings. Is like, for instance, you see this kind of, they saw this sort of need in the 60s and 70s to kind of critique the kind of centrist coalition, and critique the PCI, and critique even the Soviet Union at that time. And sociology. So there's all these kinds of strategic questions, and they're like, okay, let's create this journal, Quaderni Rossi, right? Like, let's sort of start thinking. And then they're like, wait, the workers aren't, this is a really scholarly journal. Like, the workers are not sort of engaging with this in the kind of way that we needed to. So then they're like, okay, let's have a newspaper, right? And so I think I really relate to that as a kind of career militant. I like that Daniel was like, none of us are career academics. I'm like, I'm a career militant. Just the kind of different. So I wanted to kind of maybe outline some of the strategic and political questions in my kind of career as a militant that we could talk about, or we could just kind of scrap, but that this made me think about. So I came of age I was like a 13-year-old kid in LA, born and raised in LA, come from a mixed status family. There was this kind of uptick of struggle around immigrant rights and around immigrant labor specifically. This was in 2006, when if you've met me, you've heard me talk about this kind of moment of rupture forever. But I think what was interesting about that was that that's what really kind of pulled me to the left. And it was this kind of Trotskyist organization that I don't like to talk about because it's embarrassing, but they were the ones that were sort of writing these newspapers and organizing like 13, 12-year-olds at the time. And so in that sense, I was more of a kind of, I think they targeted me because I was an organic intellectual type, right? And so part of my story is not really knowing how to transition from this role of like organic intellectual, where I could kind of articulate some pretty basic points and like organize kind of the students that were around me, other 13-year-olds, right? Like bribe them with weed and ditching, like no things like that. But also like, then elevate their consciousness or whatever at that point, right? To now where I am really, really interested in this question of knowledge production that can be in the service of kind of domestic work and not knowing really how to even fucking approach that. And that, like, because it's a different skill set, right? Like you could be an organic intellectual and not necessarily be a professional revolutionary. That's like, that takes a lot of, there's a lot of steps in between that. So then I just really wanted to kind of outline what some of those steps have been in my life, and sort of some of the places that I also draw inspiration from, both in the positive examples and negative examples. I think that, one of the first things about this newspaper is that there's a million kind of Leninist organizations in the US today that have like 50 members that all have, if that all have their own kind of newspaper and analysis. So, I've been on the other, on that end of things, right? Like trying to kind of proselytize to people with this thing. So there's that kind of, that kind of strategy and that approach. Then there's, I think I draw some inspiration in the negative sense. Actually, this is going to be taboo, but the Johnson Forest tendency, because what the Johnson Forest tendency was offered for me when I kind of recently started like digging deeper was like some of this kind of work of doing co-inquiry, right? So not just like handing the theory already, like always already to the factory worker, to the person that you're trying to organize, but actually doing kind of like co-inquiry, co-research. And in the case of the 1947 pamphlet, The American Worker, this is what Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs and crew ended up doing with this guy, Phil Singer, Paul Romano. And I was like just really excited about, okay, well, so this is like a different approach. And then I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, this is really great, right? Like Phil Singer is talking about some of his experience in the factory, being an auto worker. And then you get to the second part of it and it like the tone changes completely. And it's Grace Lee Boggs is like kind of a whole thing about how it's this kind of like pre-packaged line about like this humanist line about how the management and union bureaucrats are conspiring to mutilate the spirit and creativity of the class and like alienate them, and it's crushing and da 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 da. And I'm like, wait, but where's the voice of this worker? Like there's no kind of relay between the two, and it just kind of I felt really disappointed when I was sort of reading it. And maybe other people will be like, come to the JFT's defense, but I was actually pretty disappointed in that method of co-inquiry. So like, so then I'm also really interested in thinking about the CPUSA, like during this period in the post-war when you have like folks like Claudia Jones and Harry Haywood who are thinking about like kind of questions of Black nationalism, Black liberation, and in the case of Claudia Jones, also thinking about like knowledge production from the viewpoint of women of color and Black women specifically. I've also been involved in kind of social movement work around gentrification in Boyle Heights, where I was one of the kind of folks on this side of trying to think about like develop this kind of critique of art washing and of capital, and then of gentrification, which is a way that capital also attempts to capture some of the countercultural energies of POC. I've been part of kind of Viewpoint magazine, which is, we can talk about that too. And then kind of in the academy, right? Like this sort of tension that we have with this institution of the academy. I know both I really wanted Danielle and Renee both to participate in this because they both accused me of being an armchair revolutionary. But I think that there's a really interesting, and you're both laughing because it's true, but there is a really kind of contradictory space. You read that I'm a Ford fellow, so I'm also really invested, like on a personal level, in kind of, and in Chicano studies, in creating spaces for people of color within the academy, right? Ethnic studies programs weren't just kind of handed from above, but were like the product of kind of, self-organization that's been sort of co-opted by organizations like by the university, but also by foundations like the Ford Foundation. And then, you put that in the kind of in conversation with kind of academic worker struggles, like the recent COLA, cost of living adjustment question. And so then you just start to get into this sort of really messy, like, I don't know what I'm doing. I think I know what I'm doing strategically at some point. Sometimes I don't. This is not the most articulate thing, but this is where I am in this thought process. And I want to keep reading Tronti to like, hopefully maybe get some more kind of answers. But I think at this point I have a lot more questions than I do answers. And, then hearing all of you also is just giving me a lot more questions. So that's where I am. And I appreciate you, Andrew, for taking the time to really, learn this and translate it, not just kind of like linguistically, but also, with your work with Viewpoint and, your academic dissertation to also kind of translate these concepts into kind of political action. So that's where I'll end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maga. Again, thank you everyone for this wonderful round of inputs. I want to start off with a question that was asked by someone in the YouTube audience. And this kind of brings up the question of the kind of uneven and combined, so to speak, development of class struggle, not just in the US, but in other places, right? And the role of local left ecologies and like building vehicles of struggle. Because someone brought up that LA seems to be like a key locus for class struggle. And I think that there were already some really good connections that were made as to why that is. And this connects to operaisti investigations of the worker revolts in northern Italy that Andrew brought up. And this reminded me of Sergio Bologna's investigations into northern Italy and why it was that it popped off so hard in the early 60s and whatnot. And he found that it wasn't like any kind of spontaneity or a result of a spontaneous outburst, but rather they were the result of a highly sophisticated political history of workers, cadres, and militants who had passed on the inheritance of a certain political culture to worker groups. And he even goes as far as to assert that there's no such thing as spontaneity, that rather spontaneity is in reality the formation of microsystems of struggle that just aren't visible. And this reminds me of, Manuel, you brought up how the LA Bus Riders Union has its roots in multiple kind of histories. And that even though neoliberalization really marked a kind of like gutting of working class organization and of anti-racist organization and of feminist organization, that political history wasn't decomposed in toto. Like, and you see that the LA Bus Rider Union has part of that history anchored out of that. And so I was wondering, how do we relate to bring this together? How do we relate the reality of like, like LA still has some of these histories. New York obviously has these histories. San Francisco has these histories. Berlin has these histories and these infrastructures, but there's also an inequality at play. Because like, say, for example, I came from San Diego, and while there's totally these histories, the kind of density of these organizations and their kind of organizational legacy didn't survive to the same degree, right? And one could imagine that it's similar in, I don't know, like the middle of nowhere Germany or the middle of nowhere the US, right? That suffered this kind of decomposition much harder. And how do we think about the reality of needing to organize other parts that are yet to be organized, other localities? if that makes any sense. Does anyone
Can anyone
wanna...
answer that, or
I can speak really quickly to that.
same?
In 2019, last year in January, I wrote a piece for Commune about the UTLA teacher strike, and to put Commune on the spot a little bit right now, this was a kind of back and forth that we had around a negotiation that happened between the editorial board of Commune and what I was observing on the ground. So basically I went down to the picket lines to some of the demos last year, and being a kind of career militant that I am in LA, I was down on the ground and like just meeting with folks who were involved in like anti-gentrification work, folks who I knew from the garment workers kind of world, folks who I knew from like kind of radical cultural movements. And like everybody was down there. On the last day, right, Tom Morello did this concert, Tom Morello's mom being a kind of a longtime labor unionist, leftist too. And one of the kind of editorial comments that I kept getting from the editors at Commune was like, no, this is spontaneous, right? Like no one expected this to happen. And I was like, no, actually, my ethnographic research found that like this was a super big this was a kind of moment of articulation of these really disparate groups, and that was the kind of one point that I wanted to make about it. And so yeah, just to say that the teacher strike was a huge eye-opener of all the different kinds of both political and cultural genealogies. So I think culture really doesn't get the respect that it deserves on the left. I think and in LA, that's one of the kind of glues that holds people together, right, is music and art and things like that, and the ways those kind of there's a lot of kind of overlap, especially when you think about like the 90s movements like Rage Against the Machine, the Zapatista struggle. There's a kind of aesthetic too, and yeah, that's what I sort of observed in the UTLA struggle. I totally agree that there was a lot of things going on there, but spontaneity was not one of them.
Yeah, if I want to just really jump off that point, because I'm really glad you said that, Maga. I was working, and then eventually just through volunteer work in the tenants union, to help build some of that community input and buy-in for the UTLA strike. There was a lot of organizing that went into building that strike, but not just building the strike from the perspective of the union being prepared to go to strike, but to actually have such deep roots in the community so that the moment that the strike happened, everything from PTAs to organizations like the LA Tenants Union, organizations like the former California chapter of Acorn, all of these other organizations, both nonprofit and completely autonomous, were found their way into that struggle and continued it. It was these overlapping sort of like circuits of activism, if you will, and organizing that were activated at the same time, right? But that was a long buildup. There was, I would say that I would defend the notion of spontaneity to some degree, and I say this only because I think of Kulach, or I think of even like Tronti, and respect the fact that through the struggle, through the spontaneous sort of interaction of basically the incipient sort of character of people's lives, right? That they live through these experiences, that from them emerge, kind of a certain sort of like character sort of analysis of the world. But I'm one of these people who maybe like a Kulach reading Lenin, kind of like Tronti reading Lenin, really take seriously the role of like militants to get that, sort of experience and bring it to full articulation, right? But I did want to say, I completely agree, Maga, that sometimes people want to romanticize spontaneity and they don't recognize just how long it takes to build these things to begin with. I mean, a couple of things I wanted to say about like LA. This is a drum that I've beat a number of times, Maga, and this, that LA never gets its due as like a space for radical work. You know, there's a certain tendency, very much so in the Midwest and the East Coast, to romanticize a lot of the kind of older radicalism around union work and the like, in places like, again, like the East Coast and the Midwest, because of the industrial worker sort of connection. And very little is often said about the fact that California obviously has its own kind of reckoning with, you know, industrial or labor action, its own history of militancy from, the IWW protests of all of a century ago, and all of the work that they did around that, and the crushing of that movement by the police of the state here in Los Angeles. But part of it, I think, has to do with the composition of the working class here in LA, right? It has to do with the fact that not only were you talking historically about a large population of African Americans in a city and a state that wasn't wasn't the primary recipient of the second migration of African Americans away from the South. That was more the upper Midwest, but still we had that, California experienced that, and that they were very much the backbone oftentimes of the working class here in LA. And then increasingly after the 1960s and 70s, people like, for example, Manuel's, family, or my grandma, who came as a seamstress after the war, but also worked as a farmhand during the war, during the Second World War, to power the factories and the tables, right, or to keep fed the tables of Americans in the context of total war. And so I would really encourage folks who are listening to this conversation who are not from LA to really take seriously a lot of that history, partially because I think we're one of the only places where a lot of this exciting work is actually still happening, right? It happens to be the case that the weakness of the union movement across the West is constantly bemoaned. And say what we will about the union movement, it is actually much healthier in a place like California than it is in a lot of other parts of the country, for better and for worse, I should say. And we can talk a little bit about that. I do think that I want to talk about a few things that other folks mentioned, but I think maybe we can set that aside. I do think I want to revisit the idea of the co-inquiry, actually, Maga, because I think that that's important. Because I think there is a question, again, of what is the relationship between the militant / the party, in a different context, spontaneity, and, a particular historical conjuncture. I think that is massively, I think, under-theorized even today, I would argue, and why you have had, like Maga has mentioned, a lot of these, like, quote-unquote revolutionary sects that have spent the last 60 years building, towards very little, tragically, precisely because they haven't actually been able to read the room a little bit, right? But again, I do want to also look at what is, besides the ecology of the left in places like LA, look at the particular sort of the elements of the conjuncture in a time when Tronti was writing, and how that is different in a place like LA. We should forget that upswing in militancy of labor in the 1960s and 70s in places like Italy, but not just in Italy, you saw it obviously in France and in other parts of Western Europe and in the US, also had to, that was at the time when wages and productivity were growing basically, hand in hand. And in fact, for a brief period in the 1970s, wages almost became decoupled from productivity altogether. And that was the big, huge, abiding fear of Western European governments and capital in those states, that these countries, to use the language of the British left when a right-wing prime minister asked the country who we need to vote in an election to see or determine who governs the country. Is it the unions or is it the government? And eventually, people decided with the unions. Thank you very much, Gov. So, that is a very particular historical moment that frankly is irrecoverable now, right? We are talking about a sundering between wages and productivity that then has consequent sort of links or impacts on how people organize on the ground, both in the working place, but also outside of the workplace, right? I've already mentioned, obviously, the lack of the party. Even though in this country, sadly, too many social democrats spend their time and energy really trying to theorize the party in a context where you have a very different sort of formation of the liberal left, right? Very different historical context to what you had in, for example, places like Italy, of course, like we'll be talking about the PC, but also the PSOE in places like France, right? The geopolitics are different. There's no Cold War, not yet. There's not yet a new one, although we're getting there. And we're also talking about a context where we're operating straight in the heart of capital in the US, right? We're not doing that necessarily from the position of where we are, or rather where Tronti was, where, you know, one could arguably say that Italy operated as like an almost semi-peripheral country within the capitalist core in the 1960s and 70s, where Italy's, you know, sovereignty and its ability to act, you know, in the middle of the Cold War was very much delimited by the circumstances, by the fact that it operated as a pivot country in Europe at the time. And, you know, this is something that the PC very much understood. That, you know, to its credit, perhaps, to the theorists of the PC, they very well understood that they were in this sort of situation. And so did, you know, for example, the Soviet Union. So the Comintern, they recognized the very particular circumstances of Italy in that political context. And finally, I'd say that we have to always have a very clear-eyed appreciation for what are the balance of forces. And the balance of forces in a place like Italy, where over 4 million people were voting for the PC at the height of its power, that very much the strongest communist party outside of the Eastern Bloc and outside of Asia. They had that. They had the militant unions, even in France, where the PSOE's power kind of waned over after the 1960s. It still had, you know, these militant unions, or the connections to that vitality. We've always operated in a different context, and so it is not the incipient sort of revolutionary energies have always been there here in this country. But the composition of the working class in this country, the composition of the institutions of the working class in this country have been very different. And in many ways, I think it's been, I think as all of us recognize, it's always been more of a challenge as a result to do that. But this is where I think a lot of this organizing at the community level, I think that's where it becomes very important. I would love for us to talk about the international dimension at some point, because I have a lot to say on that too, but I'm going to stop there for now.
Andrew or Manuel, do either of you want to jump in on this? If not, I would move on to a next question. Next question. Or Andrew?
Sure. I mean, excuse me. One thing I'd say, not necessarily, there's no way to respond to everything in these wonderful presentations and in the questions you raised as well, Daniel, at the end. I mean, one thing that I think, well, I guess two things I'll try to say are, one is about this question of inquiry or co-research, which everyone has been mentioning. You know, this was a key innovation in Italy of Quaderni Rossi. They were conducting these inquiries inside factories that until that time had remained, you know, sort of opaque to the even the kind of official left sociologists. And this many of the ideas about co-inquiry, co-research that, you know, once they arrived in Turin, they'd gotten there by way of France, and before that they had come from the Johnson Forest tendency. So the American Worker was translated into French, and then this guy Danilo Montaldi, who's the teacher of Romano Alquati and others involved with Tronti, was the bridge. And so there is this transnational circulation of these practices of militancy that I think is really important, that, you know, we should keep in mind for our own struggles today, you know, sharing tactics internationally and learning from other contexts, understanding that, you know, different points in the imperialist chain, or however you want to theorize it, will necessitate different approaches. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that, you know, in Tronti's theory, there's this sort of, he gestures to this idea of what later was called the social factory, right? Which is that the whole of society outside of the factory is actually all organized in service of production, right? And this is not something that, you know, he didn't link this to, for example, feminist struggles over unwaged housework, but indeed feminist theorists in Italy picked this up and ran with it and developed, you know, basically the forebears of what we now talk about when we say social reproduction theory. And, you know, the struggles in Chicago, the struggle in LA, the struggle in Queens against Amazon, I think that these are all really interesting sites of class struggle outside of the point of value production, although maybe we can bracket how value is, you know, produced, circulated, et cetera, where the most strategic site is. block values circulation. But we have these incredible articulations of working class struggle occurring in places that are not the factory today, right? Which is not to say that point of production struggles are unimportant. Of course, we've all been inspired, I think, by the wildcats of recent months in some key factories. But I think that these sites around education, around urban infrastructure, around these sort of places where the circulation of capital is happening are super important for our contemporary understanding of class struggle. And I think that is something that even if Tronti himself wasn't talking about in his writings, because what was before his eyes were, fiat workers, auto workers, the sort of paradigmatic, industrial working class, they were the ones who were moving. So that's what prompted many of his theoretical, formulations. But I think that, we can take the sort of spirit, if not only the letter, from him and talk about many of the things that you all have mentioned.
Yeah, this brings me to how do we obviously, like as everyone has pointed out, the technical composition of capital and the working class today is very distinct from back then, and when we talk about the social factory, there's obviously most of us are interacting with the social factory and not so much with the factory, right? Like the factories in the US are few and far between, and then most of them exist in a kind of like global circuit according to capital logics to drive down labor prices and be able to control that. But in the US, I was wondering what you all think about where the points of organization are precisely then, and what kind of structures do they happen around? Manuel, you brought up, the bus is the factory on wheels, and you have to organize along there, or that's a possible kind of place to organize because of its attraction to the working class, right? The working class passes through that spot. It relies on that structure. And just as importantly, how do we develop control, or how do we develop operational control around these structures? Because like for me, one of the key arguments of Tronti is the development of operational control over the factory, right? Like you actually have the power to shut the factory down. So shut it and just do whatever the fuck you want to do because it's yours, baby. And so likewise, how do we translate that kind of strategy to these different terrains? And is that capable of translation? And how do we develop that kind of disruption out of that?
Give this a crack. I think that that what we have in front of us is a problem of governance, a problem of control of violence, right? And really also kind of a schizophrenic kind of sense of where this is all going for capitalism itself. So these are all kind of three interrelated crises that are happening, right? And I think that is what we're all kind of confronting, right? It's not like there's this kind of unified logic of where capitalism is moving toward. There is a lot of fractions between the economic kind of forces. There's a lot of fractions of the political governing sense. And then there's also then fractures of different modes of bodies or, nodes of what held the system together are breaking down in front of our eyes. In other words, if you think about the role of education, right? Now with this COVID-19, we're we're gonna get into this crisis of public education as we knew it was already being challenged under sort of like this kind of business model, uh, corporatization, charters, right? Now we're going to move into a whole new technology, a whole new sort of sense of technology, of using technology and just getting rid of the worker itself, which is the teacher themselves, right? And so I just think of a lot of these questions about where can we control, what can we do to just sort of disrupt the thing. And for the bus riders union, we actually had to use a legal tactic, right? And in some ways, unfortunately, now even that legal tactic has been taken away. So we use the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we use Title VI, we use the idea of a disparate impact. In other words, that obviously in a system of sort of the multicultural kind of governance of neoliberalism, you no longer had just white political elite saying, well, we're going to build a train and suck the money away from the bus system. No, it had a much more sophisticated set of language. There's a lot of co-optation of a lot of different forces in the community. So we had to use a legal tactic that actually was able to put us in the governance of the transportation for 10 years. We had a joint working group where there had to be decisions about where transportation is going to be, how are they going to run the transit system, how are they going to reduce, how are they going to reduce overcrowding on the bus. We did a lot of this kind of going back to these questions around investigation on the ground, right? We had to go on the ground, observe how many riders were on the bus, and this was not just paid staff. This had to be, masses of folks having to go out there counting every morning how overcrowded was a bus, or when they cut a line, right? Us going out to the community to try to figure out what was the impact of the elimination of a line or the increasing of a fare. What would be the impact on a family of 4 or 5? Why do students have to pay for public transportation? All of these kind of questions about how the system ran. We had a so-called seat on the table, and while we had a seat on the table, it didn't mean we had any real power. The real power was weighed at the end of the day by the court system. Now, in 2001, the Supreme Court basically eliminated our right to bring up a Title VI lawsuit again for disparate impact. Now you had to basically prove that that an agency was literally, outright racist and was going to do this in a way. And again, that in some ways, unfortunately, in this country, poverty and race, while completely interconnected, from a legal perspective, it is not, right? And so those are the things that I think make it really hard to think about it. And in fact, what happened in our case was that we were able to win almost $2.7 billion in bus improvements. We maintained fares, low for almost 10 years. We expanded, we expanded about 1 million hours of service. We reduced overcrowding. We created a whole new bus lines. But what happened once the courts eliminated, again, another wheeling force that was able to put some level of leverage against the enemy was taken away. And, and we had now again, people like Mayor Villaraigosa, people in the county board of supervisors who look very much like us, who were voting for a new mode of transportation. So I think it is interesting to think about, and ultimately one of the ways that we waged a struggle was in fact doing a refusal campaign of not paying fares, right? Where we were able to document about 30,000 people who participated. But again, it went hand in hand with a legal tactic that was holding the agency accountable in a time period where, again, this was a time period where most of the things were being cut. So we were in this sort of like weird dilemma where we were so-called winning, but in the confines of a complete collapse of the social infrastructure for working class people in the city.
Renee, what kind of pressure tactics were you all able to deploy in order to get the goods that you had talked about earlier?
Right. I was actually going to try to intervene on this question as it is, Danielle, because I think it actually brings forward a number of key questions, I think, that I think we should bring back to the fore. I actually want to answer that question a little bit differently first, to be honest, and kind of broaden out the scope of what we're talking about. What's interesting about COVID, what's happening with COVID-19 right now is that we talk, or folks on the left have been talking about a lot of the kind of implications of it without necessarily looking at some of what I consider some of the more important and very basic in-our-face kind of examples of what the crisis has done and what it says about the modern world and how we can potentially organize into the breach, right? So if I had to look at what are some of those channels of disruption, if you will, that have just suddenly come to the fore. One, we're seeing we have seen a breakdown in global supply chains in an order that I think people are not really kind of appreciating just how monumental that is. I think it's world historical, really, seeing how global supply chains have been strained to the point where folks are asking if certain goods are going to be able to be supplied to shops in the developed world moving forward. And so I look at that, right? I look at both the production of those goods themselves, where they are being produced, i.e. in the developing world, but also the logistical mechanisms and systems that make sure that those goods make it from, for example, the textile factories in Southeast Asia over to the United States, not just into the United States to court, but, that make it to the ports of Los Angeles and to the ports in Rotterdam or what have you, and they get transported to local markets and distributors at the ground level. So that's number one. To me, that's a very obvious sort of site of struggle that we're maybe not, we sometimes talk about it. We're really seeing the repercussions of the impact of globalization in that as a space for potential organizing. You're seeing or have seen strains in the system of financial capital, right? Or fictitious capital. It's been kind of attenuated of late because of, Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan and all these folks kind of stepping into the breach to support financial markets. We're not seeing the same meltdown that we saw in 2018 in that regard. What you are seeing, however, is a particular chokehold in rent seeking, right, to some degree, because simply put, people can't pay their rents, right? So you are seeing this very interesting sort of moment where suddenly the plight of people like renters has suddenly become a problem. And it's a problem that also big corporations themselves are kind of experiencing, given a lot of them have actually entered into the funniest rent strike in the world. Having the Cheesecake Factory on rent strike is not, necessarily the time and place I thought we would all end up in. And then finally, and I think this is a really important one, which is that we're experiencing, or rather we are living through the best education that any worker should ever get on how the discipline of labor works. And this is something, I know, I think I've written about it a couple of times. I'm blasting on about this on Facebook, where I think to myself, how is it that we're not sitting around and thinking about the fact that on the one hand, our goods, the essential goods that we need for the reproduction of social life are continuing to get to the stores. No one's actually lacking in toilet rolls as a whole, right? In some, there are enough toilet rolls to go around. There's enough chicken and beef, and there's enough, all of the stuff that we need to continue life as a whole. It still continues. Our utilities have not gone into meltdown. Nuclear power plants haven't gone into meltdown. Life is actually continuing with such a large proportion of the working people. I'm going to use a more general term, not actually working, right? Which shows us that, obviously what we mean by work itself has changed, and what we mean by productive work that would satisfy human needs is also an increasingly sort of limited aspect of that stuff, right? And yet you're seeing governors across the state, you're seeing even the most quote unquote progressive elected leaders across the developed world screaming at the top of their lungs that they have to send workers back to work. And you look at that and you say, okay, well, yes, that is because, again, capital is not, whatever. You could say what you will about why it is that they're doing that on a very superficial level, But to me, I think the more important question has been, and I think this is something that I would argue very strongly, I think Tronti would care about a lot, is why are we struggling or yearning for workers to get back under the whip of the boss? And that's because ultimately what we care about is also almost like a culture or a psychology of work, right? This idea that you don't have to work and society can continue to operate, that it can continue as is something that I think bosses and elected officials are extremely aware of. The right seems to be very aware of it because they're saying it. They're saying it very openly that we cannot continue to allow people to stay at home because doing so will give them the belief that not working pays, quote unquote, just as much as working, right? And so I think that we're forgetting about that deep psychological or socio-psychological aspect, right, of what the discipline of labor really looks like and what the class system red in tooth and claw actually looks like. And so what I'd say is that there's a lot of space in all of these different places for us to be organizing into. Again, yes, the development of the goods themselves, also the logistical chains that link the global economy together and which are increasingly fraying as a result of this and as a result of geopolitical tensions. As I've said, and I could talk a lot about, the system of rents, right? About what we mean by that. There are different forms of rents. When we talk about residential rents in particular, obviously we're seeing an increasing number of people. I think the last statistics that I saw from the Census Bureau suggest something between 19 and 20% of renters in the United States didn't or weren't able to pay their full rent in the last month or so. So you're seeing that difficulty, right? That dependent relationship between landlord and tenant being strained by the current moment. And that is a moment in which obviously the organizations like the tenants union are intervening into. And then again, finally, I think the discipline of labor, where I think, frankly, we haven't done enough. I don't think the left has done enough to think about what this means and how we educate people about what that means and how we organize into that. And so I'd like to open that up. The one thing I'd say also, though, ultimately about where we struggle, right, where we do this work, ultimately for us, it has to be about looking at what the circulation of capital looks like, right? We don't know where it's quote unquote going because I don't think, capitalism is a conspiracy, right? That's not how that works. But we do know where capital is, and we know where people are facing its sharpest edges at any given point in time. And we know where people, I think, quote unquote, spontaneously, organically, are not just confronting it, they are actually rebelling in opposition to it, right? And I think it is the task of all of us who are militants to recognize, find those points, refine and articulate what they mean, and organize into that breach. That is what we should be doing. And ultimately, for that reason, I think this is why I think it's important to outline the kind of broader spaces where we should be focusing in our energies. Again, for my part, obviously, this is what the rent strike fight is all about, because we need to think about and should always be very cognizant of what our tactics look like and how they intervene in a particular political moment. I don't actually consider 20% of Americans or renters in America being on rent strike. What is actually happening is the fact that 20% of Americans simply can't pay their rent. That's a very different sort of thing. It doesn't mean, however, that of that 20% of Americans, we can't and shouldn't be, and we are actually organizing them into very self-consciously knowing that what they are doing is withholding their rent. That it isn't just because an external sort of disaster has put it upon them, the fact that they can't do or struggle for more, or that they can't refuse, right? That they can't refuse to pay their rent. I think it is the job of militants really to kind of sharpen that particular perspective. You can refuse to do this, and you should refuse to do this, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to feed yourself. And I think that that's something that this moment can do a lot to sharpen. Although we have to be very, very careful and very cognizant of the fact that the other side knows it. And in fact, tragically, from what I've seen so far from the left response, they know it better than we do. They know it better than we do that they are in a critical moment where all of these myths of how our system works are being just knocked on their side. And what are they doing to respond to that? They're reopening our economies and putting, the lives of working class people on the line. And we should be very clear in articulating that.
sorry, I got lost for a second. My call dropped for a second. But I think we're talking about like possibilities for thinking about operational control and refusal. So I'll respond quickly to that. I just have a sort of quick point to make about like the social reproduction strike, and I think today we're seeing a lot more of that. I'm with one of the aspects of the kind of 68 60s kind of movements in the West and Italy in particular, that have always fascinated me has been these kind of auto reduction campaigns, because I think another thing that we don't talk enough about is like, you know, the anarchists are really, really good about like autonomy and like community gardens and like, you know, taking over buildings and squatting them and things like that. But this was a kind of moment where there was like just this confluence of like, you know, these kind of theorists thinking about like the technical aspects of capital and along with these kind of cultural movements of auto reduction. So that's why I'm really excited that Renee and Manuela have both spoken about kind of contemporary 21st century like equivalents of auto reduction campaigns. I want to see a little bit more of, no, I don't know, I'm making that joke, but like, you know, people were, from what there's that really great semiotext coffee table book about autonomia and post-political politics, where they talk about like people would go into like really, really fancy restaurants and then just refuse to pay. But we're talking here about more kind of modest things like, you know, you can't pay rent. And I really appreciate you, Renee, saying that there's a difference between a rent strike that's kind of self-conscious and, you know, people not being able to pay rent, because I think that's a sort of really interesting distinction. But just to say that really quickly, when I think about refusal, the strategy of refusal or the strike, I'm thinking about it from the point of view of women's work or social reproduction or domestic work, however you want to call it, or care work. And the idea that, you know, when we talk about refusal, when it comes to people who take care of children, babies, of the elderly, of people with disabilities, you're talking about a kind of refusal that means, you know, possibly, quite possibly someone dying, right? And someone very vulnerable dying. So I think that one of the kind of interesting ways that, you know, Trontian kind of era operaismo has influenced, I think, as Andrew pointed out, Marxist feminism, or we might call social reproduction theory, on this question of refusal. I really think that the kind of contemporary Marxist feminists were onto something when thinking about how there's no such thing as a general strike, right? Silvia Federici says this, to mean that, you know, the second that you're refusing, you're also already engaging in a process of kind of creation of alternatives, right? Like, it's not enough to just refuse, but as you're refusing, you have to, unless you want like children to die, you have to kind of organize care, alternative methods of care that are not mediated by the market, or and I think, like I said, I think the anarchists talk a lot more about this kind of stuff. So what we're seeing right now is like, you know, for a while, like people, I feel like when I was coming up in the kind of LA scene of the 90s and 2000s, there was like a billion anarchists talking about like, you know, solidarity and mutual aid and things like this. And then for a while that sort of died down, except in sort of little pockets. Maybe Occupy was another kind of moment where people were thinking about like alternative organizing. But I'm seeing that a lot right now in kind of Corona times, people talking about mutual aid and kind of food distribution and forms of caretaking. I think that we have an opportunity to, as leftists, to think about also these alternatives right now.
It's a this is a great series of comments and something I wish we could explore forever. Like I think something that's coming up here is that I've heard in a number of things that people have said is this notion of sort of counter institutions, independent or autonomous forms of organization, and then this, you know, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, this problem of political subsumption or co-optation by the state or by capital of the self-activity of the working class, broadly understood. And I think we all recognize that there's this tension, right, between needing to struggle. You know, Tronti says that the working class is within and against capital, one time within it and one time against it, right? And I think that we all recognize, and, you know, after decades of experiments, I think, you know, the left kind of writ large became a little bit tired of the sort of purity of counter institutions completely outside of the state or something like that. This is almost a commonplace to even say something like this now. But I think that to try to knit together the problematic of a counter institution of an autonomous form, for Tronti, the PCI actually is this because it's never in the majority government, right? The key reason why he thought renovating the Communist Party was possible and wielding it as a revolutionary force was possible was precisely because it wasn't part of the majority government. I mean, they had elected deputies, of course, so, and many people, you know, quibbled with this. But I think that that's really important, that there needs to be one foot outside. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that the state will subsume movements and create new terrain, which sometimes looks like a reform, sometimes looks like a new, you know, a new field on which working class people can reproduce themselves and survive. And I think that, but I think what's important is to keep our eye on the expanded political composition of the working class after victories like that, so that they are precisely victories rather than, you know, sort of crumbs handed out, palliatives. And I think that's what Renee was gesturing to with the idea of a rent strike as an active, politically organized effort, ideally linked to an international analysis of capitalism, rather than simply, you know, sort of inability to pay. So thanks for all of these really rich thoughts.
I wanted to bring up a question. Renee, you were talking a lot about we as the left have to do this, but that we ultimately has to become some kind of, that goes through some kind of organizational housing, right? So I was wondering what is the organizational forms where what we as the left should do become realized. And this also goes with Andrew's questions about like counter institutions and whatnot. And at the same time, the capacity to realize stable, permanent organization demands a certain capacity and know-how on the behalf of the people that are doing the organizing. And I think a lot of us as organizers know that when we first start off as this, like, we don't know what the fuck we're doing. And that actually is a special kind of skill set to learn how to build good, stable organizations that people feel comfortable in and can grow in and realize their kind of collective strengths in. How do we meet the need of capacity building across distance and space, given the uneven distribution of the left, of left infrastructures geographically? And this becomes even more pertinent, right, under COVID, where it may be for the next half decade that we are on again, off again, reduced to our digital forms.
I mean, if I can just, I wanted to say a couple of things on what Andrew kind of closed on in the previous point. I've said this a lot. 60% of all financial investments globally are in property. 45% of global investments are in residential property in particular, right? And there's a reason why, again, our analysis starts from that reality, because I think it's important and we shouldn't elide that. On this idea of the hub, I hate to be that guy, but we still need the fucking party. I mean, we still need to build something that will be the space through which, if not things will be mediated, but these discussions can happen in a way that people understand, right? But, you know, look, within the LA Tenants Union itself, we are working very hard towards building an institution where we can exchange our thoughts, our ideas, our analysis with other like-minded autonomous tenants unions. We, in the last, I think on May 1st, actually, itself on May Day, we announced the creation of ATUN, which is the Autonomous Tenant Union Network, which consists currently of dozens of tenants unions across North America. I believe the London Renters Union might also be a part of it, but regardless, we're still in conversation with them. Look, we ultimately still need to build these institutions and to recognize that the fight is going to look different in every terrain, but the fight in some ways, in a broader sense, is obviously the same. And so, you know, this is something that we have done and are going to continue to build on, ultimately. And you're right, Daniel, Atun is a fantastic name, you know. Look, ultimately, we have to kind of look at, there's always a danger, I think, in discussing kind of these broader institutions and why they survive, right? And we can either fetishize them or we can kind of deeply misunderstand them. I think the Democratic Party is actually one of these examples of an institution that I think people massively misunderstand, where I think that the notion has always been that, well, I'm gonna stick to one particular kind of observation about it, which is that the party builds, it has a relationship of dependency in particular with kind of oppressed categories of people in particular. That dependency is not one-sided, and I think that this is a big problem or fault of, I think, kind of the Bernicrat left that it oftentimes makes in believing that, or understanding the party to just be this kind of top-down organization that tells kind of working class people what to do, without recognizing actually that oftentimes the party in different parts of the country has built these kind of organic and deep connections, networking circuits of relationships, if you will, with kind of appointed leaders, if you will, in these communities. And that relationship is very dynamic. I think it's important for us to kind of recognize what that looks like. Any institution that we build cannot be based on the idea of building a dependent relationship. And I know that I know it sounds like an amorphous, unclear sort of dynamic, but I think it has to start from building a movement of movements, really, right? What that means is we have to get the autonomous character of all these different sort of disparate social movements, tie them together into a kind of a shared analysis of the world and the things that we want to accomplish. And then we need to discuss how, you know, that then permeates or becomes institutions or congeals into institutions of working class power. Now, those institutions cannot be dogmatic, and I don't mean this dogmatic in the way that I think anarchists oftentimes mean. I mean this in the sense that we have to be fluid. I'm very much a believer in institutions and structure. I'm also a believer in the idea not that they have to be porous, but that they have to be flexible. And at any given point in time, if an infrastructure of the left is not if it is not flexible, if it doesn't actually meet the moment in history that we're facing, then it is no longer of any value. Again, I would argue that is probably the most Leninist sort of description of the relationship of the party. The moment that it becomes disconnected from the actual needs, the interests of working class people, then it is, you know, no longer fit for purpose. That is an observation, again, that a lot of folks, both on the other side of the Iron Curtain, you know, oftentimes made, but it was certainly one that, again, it's Italian operaists and others made as well. And I think that is something that we need to be very, very focused on as well. And so it has to start from that principle that there's a lot of, you know, kind of quote unquote revolutionary energy already there. A lot of it's incipient, a lot of it is inchoate. A lot of it is increasingly becoming organized, and it is self kind of identified as being consciously part of a broader sort of movement against the world as it is, right? And it has to be organized first and foremost on that level of mutual understanding. We need to create more ATUNs, if you will. We need to create more of them. We need to be able to foster them. We need to treat them as actual spaces of critical debate and organizing spaces where we learn. In the same way, I think, Daniel, you put it very well. on the question of organizing, you said that, we oftentimes forget when we jump into this thing that we don't know what we're really getting ourselves into. I would argue that no organizer ever knows what they're doing in any single fight, and all of the rent strikes that I have helped organize, not a single one of them have ever looked the same. And every single one of them comes with its own particularities, even if the tactic, broadly speaking, is very similar, right? If in the same way that an organizer has to confront the challenges of organizing working class people where they are that disparate or rather that different and that varied, then in the same way, a lot of the movements that we're going to bring together are going to be variegated to begin with, even if, again, eventually all of us agree on this one thing that, the world as it exists is not enough, and we deserve better, right? So we have to start, though, building these institutions, the faster, the better. And folks, actually, just wanted to say to the moderator, I'm very sorry, but I have another engagement that I have to jump onto right now. So thank you so much for having me on the panel, and I'd like to do this again at some point. You're all great.
Yeah, that said, I think we also reached our time limit, right?
It seems like a good point to stop on that sort of impassioned plea. Renee, I'm sorry you're going. We had a great discussion about housing yesterday. I want to link you up with the people in that. I think they got to know what the School of Echoes is. I'm fascinated when I hear that. And thank you, everybody else. I think you embody the difference between theory and academicism. We need theory next to practice, going back and forth, but it needs to be part of something concrete, and it needs to be things that are something that's accessible. So I find this discussion dazzling. I'm sure that someone from this group is going to find a way to bring together Tronti and Postone and cross that gulf between value form theorists and operaismo that always gets stuck into these unproductive discussions about the labor theory of value, yes or no, or so forth. So with that, and I say thank you. I do my last pitch for money here, which is please, yeah, Daniel, you should go to bed, man. If it's like 1 o'clock over in Berlin, you should take it. Yeah, and you've done yeoman's work there. I've been. Let's see, we need some money, and you can do that by going to www.redmayseattle.org, clicking on donate, or you can do that on our YouTube channel. Just click down there on the donate or subscribe. Also, if we get more subscribers, over 1,000, we can get the CC captions, which would be great. Real-time CC captions. I also want to mention what we got coming up next. And basically, well, we have it at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, The Age of Circulation Struggle, with Joshua Clover, Nick Estes, Glenn Coulthard, Michael Hart, Phil Neal wrote a great book called Hinterland. Camila Vergara is going to talk about Chile. It should be great. And Sarah Jaffe of Belabored is going to step in as a moderator, which is great at the last moment. We have tomorrow at 3 p.m. Abolish the Family with Kathy Weeks and Michelle O'Brien, Sarah Jaffe again, and Sophie Lewis. And at 6 p.m. we have Pacific time again, Predation Confronts Decline with Robert Brenner and Aaron Benonev to give us a kind of longer term economic picture. On Saturday, we have at 1 p.m. the COVID crisis in the carceral state with Dan Berger, Jackie Wang, Brett Story, who made a wonderful film, The Prison in 12 Landscapes, which is also a book, J.M. Wong, Nikita Oliver, who was the mayoral candidate for the People's Party in Seattle, Elise Thorburn, so it should be great. And at 5 p.m. on Saturday, we have The Ghosts of Marxism's Spectre Editors in Conversation on Crisis, 6 editors of the new magazine, Spectre, which is really interesting. And by the way, I kept thinking about that when Maga was talking about all those groupuscles that had their own newsletter that they put out with a particular line, and what it was like reading that, and how strange it was to get in the present to see groups that are still doing that, when A, you have the internet and all sorts of blogs, and B, you have Viewpoint, or you have Spectre, or you had Commune. But you know, all this stuff going around, how can you still sort of live in this encloistered universe of this online paper? It's an interesting question. But anyway, Spectre, this great new publication, Charlie Post, David McNally, Holly Lewis, Kate Dahl Griffiths, Vanessa Wills, Zachary Levinson, are all going to pick a favorite quotation from somewhere in the Marxist tradition on crisis and elaborate on that. Boy, that's a good idea for a panel. I wish I thought of that, but I didn't. So anyway, come and see all that stuff. Thanks a lot for joining Red May. We've only got about 4 or 5 more events. Enjoy them while you can. Support us for next year so we can do it live. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Manuel, I got a story for you. Quickly, because I know we got to get off here. I mean, just thinking, you know, what you're thinking of